Hello, I'm Tara Thompson-Cusack, President and CEO of the Troy Chamber of Commerce, and I'm here to welcome you to the 15th Annual Nonprofit Management Conference, hosted by the Troy Chamber of Commerce and presented by PNC Bank. PNC Bank has been our presenting sponsor for numerous years, and we appreciate their continued support to the Troy Chamber and the entire nonprofit community. As we all know, the philanthropic community has drastically changed due to the pandemic. We all had to find new ways to communicate, fundraise, and manage our operations. Now more than ever, we need to support each other, learn new skills, and embrace the changes to define our new normal. Today, we will be learning from subject experts in an array of topics to help support the nonprofit community. Throughout the day, we will have the ability to learn and connect on a virtual platform. Please use the chat to ask questions, connect with other event guests, and visit the virtual networking room via the icon on the left. I'd also like to point out our virtual expo center, where you can meet with our gold and silver sponsors, Tryon Solutions, Motown Digital, Mutual of America, and Hunch Free on how they can help your nonprofit. We also know many of our friends and colleagues have been furloughed and are looking for new opportunities so they can make an impact. Today, you will have the opportunity to meet with representatives from Apparatus Solution and NTech Staffing in the recruitment booths who are looking to fill positions right now. Please make sure to meet with the recruiters in their recruitment booths located in the virtual expo room at the top of the page. Also, make sure you visit all of our exhibitors in the Expo Center by clicking the Expo icon to the left. Many of the virtual booths will have information and representatives there to answer any questions through the virtual booth chats. Special thanks to Walsh College, American Society of Employers, the Nonprofit Spot, New Horizons Rehabilitation Services, Nonprofit Personnel Network, NPNN, Lady Sarah and the Magic Soiree, Oakland University, and Leadership Oakland for joining us today as exhibitors. I'd like to also thank all of our breakout speakers for sharing their wisdom with all of our attendees today. And finally, it is my absolute honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Melanca Clark. Melanca Clark is President and CEO of the Hudson-Webber Foundation in Detroit, Michigan. Prior to joining the foundation in August of 2016, Melanca held several senior positions in the Obama administration, including Chief of Staff of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services at the U.S. Department of Justice, Senior Policy Advisor with the White House Domestic Policy Council, and Senior Counsel with DOJ's Access to Justice Initiative. Prior to her government service, Melanca served as counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law, a John J. Gibbons Fellow in Public Interest in Constitutional Law at the Gibbons Law Firm, a Skadden Fellow and Assistant Counsel with Economic Justice Group of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. She also served as law clerk to the Honorable Joseph A. Greenaway, Jr., U.S. District Court of New Jersey, adjunct professor at Seton Hall University of Law, and litigation associate with Paul Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison. Clark earned her law degree from Harvard Law School and her undergraduate degree from Brown University. Clark serves on the advisory boards of the LISC Detroit, University of Michigan's Youth Policy Lab, and the boards of the Council of Michigan Foundation, Downtown Detroit Partnership, Michigan Future Incorporated, and the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency. She resides in Detroit with her husband, Madi Teray, and 2 children. Melanca, it is my honor to introduce you, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. I am so pleased to help welcome you to the 15th Annual Nonprofit Management Conference. My name is Melanca Clark, and I am the President and CEO of the Hudson-Webber Foundation. We're a private independent foundation that was created to support organizations and initiatives that move the city of Detroit forward. We've got a very long history in our city, but it's predicated on the enduring legacy of the generosity of the Hudson and Webber families that operated the J.L. Hudson department stores for nearly a century. So when Tara invited me to speak at this convening last winter, in fact, of course the plan was for me to be here in person with you all. We might have started with me begging your indulgence as I pulled you from your coffee and your networking, and instead I am here in my home office. I am hoping that my kids are not going to run in here to interrupt me as I beam these remarks to you. And I will also candidly share that I am in my sweatpants. So to state the obvious, the ground has shifted beneath our feet. The arrival of the COVID pandemic has affected every aspect of our lives, and that health crisis, of course, at last count, has seen over 200,000 cases in our state, and we've seen nearly 8,000 deaths. An economic crisis, of course, has been a companion piece to that pandemic. And I'd say while this has revealed our shared and interconnected vulnerability, it's also further exacerbated and revealed the racial fault line in our country. The brutal murder of George Floyd, which was a match on gasoline, in fact, triggered massive protests across the country and a further reckoning of the enduring racism in this country and ongoing disparate treatment. The last thing I'd add to this picture is a very close election, which has not surprised us, but certainly underscored how deeply divided our country is. And it's worth noting that the challenge here is that, as we think about those challenges that face our country, it's not only that our nation and communities don't agree on how to address those challenges, but in fact disagree about what those challenges are. So I'd say the demands on the nonprofit sector have increased in some instances exponentially against this backdrop. Certainly that's been particularly true for those organizations that are providing basic human needs and food. But I'd say more generally, the need for organizations that foster volunteerism, community connection, organizations that bring the collective together for the common good are needed now more than ever. At the very time that these demands on the nonprofit sector have increased, the economic and public health risks that have gone along with the pandemic have severely constrained the traditional sources of revenue used to run operations. The galas, the fundraisers, the rubber chicken circuit, all those things on which the sector so heavily relies have had to be canceled or completely reimagined. Government contracts, which are an even bigger form of lifeblood for the sector, are in jeopardy as local and state budgets contract, and there's a question mark hovering over whether there will be congressional action to address those shortfalls. And one of the cruel ironies of this time, the good work done that many in the sector have done over the last few decades, which has been to increase organizational stability by expanding revenue derived from fees for service, have made those organizations even more susceptible to the economic contraction, more exposed to that. And I'd say the performing arts sector in particular is facing an existential crisis. So this is a moment of profound disruption, obviously. I thought I might take some time to share a bit about what the philanthropic sector's response has been to this crisis, with a real eye toward inviting philanthropy and the nonprofit sector, which it partners, of course it's also in that sector, but really to think about the ways in which we might hold each other accountable to what this moment requires. So I'll start and just talk about a couple of trends in that regard. So the first one I just want to underscore for you is that philanthropy, that the pandemic has pushed philanthropy to be more flexible and responsive. I think that many foundations, for example, would have thought that is what we had been doing all along, but certainly the urgency of this moment pushed many of us to loosen or eliminate restrictions on current grants, make new grants as unrestricted as possible, and really reduce what we ask from nonprofit partners in the terms of process, all that paper. Many foundations have committed to pledges that articulate those activities and commit us to undertaking them. I know at our foundation, we of course, we schedule our board meetings a year in advance. liberating to come off that board cadence and meet when we needed to push grants forward. We certainly worked harder to help grantees navigate our bureaucracy. We advanced payments, we delayed deadlines, and the like. Many foundations are actually also considering increasing their payout or have already done so. And most notably, foundations like Kellogg as well as CS Mod have actually committed to spend down from their endowment to meet this moment. So what's been the result of these activities? Obviously, research remains to be done, but one observation that many have seen is that more dollars have been flowing to diverse populations and organizations as foundations have really honed in on where the dollars are needed most. In fact, a group of funders in Chicago actually mapped their investments, aggregate investments, pre and post-COVID, and saw a significant increase in investment in Black and Brown-led organizations and Black and Brown neighborhoods. This has raised an important question for philanthropy, a question of whether our policies and practices are compounding racial inequity. One of a recent study that I had an opportunity to take a look at was looking at early start nonprofits. And the funder looked at their diverse sources of philanthropic investment and realized that there were disparities among them, that the Black-led organizations, the average size of their grants were significantly smaller than their counterparts, their white-led counterparts. And also, the nature of those grants were different in the sense that they were restricted. So the white-led organizations were more likely to get general operating support and the trust that engenders, and the Black and Brown-led organizations were more likely to have very specific strictures around how the dollars would be used. So it raises some important questions for our sector. Not new to this moment, but this moment is underscoring these questions of what to do about that. And that brings us to a discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which have certainly been buzzwords that have been used for some time, but are very much in our conversation right now. I just want to use a metaphor around that a friend and colleague, Angelique Powers, has so helpfully pulled together. And that's the idea of a restaurant. So you own a restaurant. Diversity is essentially keeping everything the same in your restaurant, but inviting people that look different from you in to enjoy a meal. That's what diversity looks like. Inclusion means checking on the folks in that restaurant, asking them if they're comfortable, do they need more salt in their meal to make it more to their liking, are they comfortable in the seat they have, and that sort of thing. That's inclusion. Equity is a paradigm shift. That's the question of who is owning and setting the table, and who is deciding who to invite to the dinner and has power to set the menu or agenda. Really, it's really about sharing power and resources. So I'd say from an organizational perspective, philanthropy is grappling with this diversity question. So really thinking about holding ourselves accountable around who is getting funded. But increasingly, because of the moment, we are having conversations around what is getting funded. How are we, what are we to do? How might we think about getting resources into control of communities that are setting their own agenda? And the way that, impacts the relationship between organizations that are working with philanthropic partners and the reverse is really, at least, and I'll speak from my foundation's perspective, it's not only counting heads and asking folks around their operations whether they've got diverse leadership, particularly as they're serving diverse communities, but it's also understanding how they are planning their programming and strategy. How is that being informed? Are the communities that are being served, are they being touched? Are those most proximate to the problems and also to the solutions being included in the programming direction? And that has become an explicit for us as we think about the questions we ask our partners, our potential partners. That's a very important question that we ask, and we're not alone in that regard. So the other thing I'd say that's happening in the sector as a result of all that has happened in our nation and globally, obviously, over the last year, is an increasing interest in funding systems change. Given the deep-seated inequities in our society, um, I would say that philanthropy in general is getting more comfortable with taking a long view, considering the policy and system reform changes needed that address root causes, right? That are not just about upstream addressing the symptoms of problems, but going downstream to get to those root issues. That has typically been hard for many in the philanthropic sector to fund because it's not easy, right? There are no quick wins. Systems change work is not linear, it is messy, it takes many voices and many different stakeholders to advance the ball down the field, and there needs to be a lot of patience to see that get played out. It's certainly the case that the expansive and transformative change that we'd like to see is not going to be achieved within a typical grant period. One thing that philanthropy has been doing has really been taking the time to be thoughtful about the way in which our grant-making policies can get in the way of systems change. There's been discussion around grants that might foster competitiveness and support hero organizations that are coming in to save the day when that's not truly how things get done. So we think about how might we change our funding practices to see the outcomes, shared outcomes. And I just mention a funders collaborative as a great example of that the Hudson-Webber Foundation is leading, which is called the Michigan Justice Fund. It's a funders collaborative that is focused on systems change around the justice system. There are many different components, but ultimately we are trying to make investments that support the ecosystem of justice system players that ensure that there's equitable and effective justice policy in our state, and that the reliance that we have on incarceration, the over-reliance, I would say, and that costs our public fist so many dollars, can be reinvested in communities in ways that drive better dividends around community safety and well-being. So when we started this fund, we were we didn't want to sit in an ivory tower, as it were, and come up with what our grant-making strategy is. We've spent the last 6 months working with a learning cohort of practitioners of organizations that are policy organizations and also that provide direct services. We have convened a table that they are at. We have offered a stipend to those organizations, very much recognizing the time that they are giving us. But we are very much looking to their input and expertise as we map out what the opportunities and priority investments should be for the fund. I'm so excited about the work. And for us, it looks very different than our traditional grant making. But the point is, and I'll add one more thing about that. The other thing that is exciting about this work is that it's bringing diverse stakeholders from across the state, some of which work together, but many of whom don't have an opportunity to work together. So we are trying to build trust around that cohort, which we know will pay dividends beyond any particular grant objective, for example. But, in general, I would say that we as a society are questioning the status quo. Philanthropy is doing that as well. And I would say to the fundraisers among you that it is a time for you to consider, as you advocate for funding for your organizations, to frame those asks really around the proposition that those investments will be in some ways invested to put you out of business. And by that I mean, for those, and we of course need our organizations to be on the front lines responding to the needs in our community. But I think what's important to consider is that those organizations have important inputs being so close to the populations that they serve, and thinking about addressing the root causes as I described. And so I think that is certainly why we have organizations that provide direct services at our learning cohort for the Michigan Justice Fund. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that as important and critical as the work is on those front lines, that you have a voice that should be tapped, and we have an obligation, and not just in philanthropy, but throughout the stakeholders, public sector stakeholders and such, to get your input on what are those interventions, policy interventions, and other upstream efforts that might create the conditions for which the services that you provide are no longer needed. So I'll note that, over these months, I have just felt so privileged to see the work of partners throughout the region that have really inspired me in these really hard times, that are responding to these trends or leading them, in fact. And I'll just note a few things. I've been inspired by seeing the United Ways across our state and their partner organizations mobilizing so rapidly to address the very greatest needs in our communities. I've seen food banks figuring out how to deliver food safely to families, turning on a dime and getting those operations up and running. Folks running homeless shelters have come together to triage and facilitate COVID housing. They've worked together in ways they've never had to before to make sure that those populations are safe. I know just on that collaboration point, we support advocates that work as I mentioned, around policy reform, and I have in the justice system sector really been inspired by those advocates that work on justice reform issues, coming together to advocate for populations that are confined within prison and that are experiencing the greater exposure and effects of COVID that happen in those confined settings. It has been wonderful to see the collaborative efforts in that regard. I've been inspired by partners of the Detroit public school system here, who have worked quickly to figure out how to address the fact that many of our families in Detroit don't have access to the devices that are needed to access remote learning. And in so doing, are thinking beyond just those students, but to their families, and how collaborative and coordinated efforts to address the digital divide can extend beyond just the schools, the students in those schools, but to entire families and communities. I've been inspired by performing arts organizations that are using this moment to reinvent their programming. I want to give a specific shout out to the Michigan Opera Theater, who, with a dynamic new artistic director, literally staged an opera in the parking lot, which was directly responsive to COVID. It allowed folks to safely enjoy the performance, but frankly, was so dynamic in that it brought people, aficionados and folks that are new to the opera. It thought of new ways to engage them that I think will last well beyond COVID and are an example of the type of innovative reinvention that is happening across the sector. The last thing I'd mention in this regard is that it's also been inspiring to see those in the sector, the nonprofit sector, really think about how to take care of their staff. I was one of our nonprofit partners established mental health days and did other well-being and self-care for their staff that I literally learned about and then used for my staff. So inspired by that, really understanding how close we can be to burnout given the demands that I've identified, the demands on our services, but also the operational challenges that we've had to work through to make sure that our work gets done. So, certainly, this is a time of profound disorientation and pain, but I appreciate, as I've said, that it is pushing all of us to innovate and to really radically rethink our roles, our operations, and our relationships with the communities that we serve. I want to close by thanking each and every one of you for the important work that you do. I trust that you will find today's sessions productive and informative and leave energized for the work ahead. Thanks so much.
For more than 160 years, PNC has been committed to providing our clients with excellent service and powerful expertise to help them meet their financial goals. We are proud of our long-standing history of supporting not only our customers, but also our employees, shareholders, and the communities where we do business. Our most important asset? Our people. We work together to sustain a diverse and inclusive workplace where every one of our 53,000 employees can contribute to the company's success. Diversity and inclusion are among our corporate values, but we don't just talk about them at PNC, we live them. In order to build the most diverse, highest performing teams, we seek out employees who bring diversity of thought and experience to create innovative solutions that meet the needs of our increasingly diverse customer base. And we know the best and brightest talent is found across gender, race, age, sexual orientation, ability, and other segments. So we're proud to count among our employee ranks some of the most powerful women in banking and leaders who represent PNC and their cultural communities, all within a workforce that is 5 generations strong. And we're on a mission to be known as an employer of choice for people with disabilities. And as a Main Street bank, we know that when our clients and communities thrive, we thrive.